Hi class, today we're going to be wrapping up Egypt, specifically talking about the New Kingdom of Egypt, the stuff we haven't covered, and the Third Intermediate Period. Now this video is a little bit different than your other videos because we don't have a chapter from Story of the World for this video, and that's because Story of the World kind of ends its study on Egypt with the last chapter that we read on Tuthmosis and Hatshepsut. But I think it's important that we finish off the New Kingdom in the Third Intermediate Period, specifically because we didn't study Ramses II, and I think he's really important to study. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. So you don't have any reading, but this video will be a little bit longer. So in this video, we will review Egypt, what we've studied so far. We're going to kind of give you a connection between Tuthmosis III, the last pharaoh we studied, to Ramses II, and then we're going to delve into Ramses II, specifically the Battle of Kadesh and his building projects. Then we will discuss the end of the New Kingdom of Egypt. So let's start with your review. Here is kind of a graph to show you, or a table to show you what we've studied so far. I added dates and lengths so you get kind of an idea in your head of how much time has passed in each of these time periods. I want you to kind of know how the Old Kingdom of Egypt lasted 515 years, New Kingdom lasts 500 years. You can see the intermediate periods are the shortest in length. And if you take a look at the dates, we have studied all the way from 3100, and today we'll finish off with 1070 BC. So it's quite a bit of time that we've covered. So let's start with early dynastic. This is dynasties 1 to 2. Narmer unites Egypt around 3100, and this is a period where Egypt's government and economy is growing. We don't know a ton about this period, but we do know that the pharaoh is viewed as a god. Egypt is a polytheistic society with a pantheon of gods. They have many, many gods that they worship, and they believe that these gods are an integral part of just the everyday happenings of their lives and what happens with the weather and their crops in the Nile and things like that. The Old Kingdom of Egypt is from dynasties 3 to 6. This kingdom, or this time period, is characterized by pyramid building, and Egypt was united and prosperous and very strong. Some of the famous pharaohs are Djoser, who built the Step Pyramid, Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. Remember, he was traditionally thought to be a very evil person, and then Snefru, who built the Northern Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid. The Old Kingdom of Egypt declines because they were wasting a lot of money and lives on pyramid building. Remember how we talked about building pyramids is cool and great and all, but the people and the time and the energy and the materials being devoted to these projects are not necessarily giving back to the rest of the economy. These people aren't producing food that people can eat or building houses that people can live in, and so this really ended up affecting their economy. Intermarriage was causing genetic issues. We know that the pharaohs believed they were deity. They could only marry deity, so they could only marry within the royal household. In intermarriage, and then their kids intermarried, and those kids intermarried, and it caused issues. Drought occurred, and the Nile floods decreased, and we know that anytime the Nile floods decrease, it's typically connected with an unstable time in Egypt, which in this case is the first intermediate period. So this is dynasties 7 to 10. There are many insignificant pharaohs ruling and fighting for power. There are a lot of dynasties ruling at the same time, and government officials called nomarchs are gaining a lot of power. And Mentuhotep II finally reunites Egypt after almost 150 years of Egypt being divided. This leads us into the Middle Kingdom, which is just dynasties 11 and 12, just 2 dynasties. And once again, it's united and it's prosperous. This time period is characterized by flourishing art and literature, specifically art and literature that focuses on everyday common people's experience and their stories and their lives, and nature and things like that. Whereas before, art and writing were primarily tools that were used to glorify the pharaoh. Construction on the Karnak temple complex begins during the Middle Kingdom. Egyptian pharaohs expand into Nubia. Two of the famous pharaohs that we studied are Amenemhet I and Senusret III. The second intermediate period is from dynasties 13 to 17. Again, because it's an intermediate period, it's weak and divided. The 13th and 14th dynasties are ruling at the same time, and this is when Hyksos invade Egypt. Now remember that the Hyksos didn't just like come and invade and take over. They were already living there, and when they saw that Egypt was declining and becoming weak, they saw their opportunity and took over. They defeat the 13th and 14th dynasties. They begin the 15th dynasty, and the 16th and 17th rule alongside them for a while. Almost finally drives the Hyksos out of Egypt. And this begins the New Kingdom of Egypt, dynasties 18 to 20. So New Kingdom is very united, very prosperous. This is the most famous time period probably in Egyptian history. The pharaohs are buried in the Valley of Kings, hidden, and Egypt becomes an empire. It's imperialistic. It expands to twice its size, as you can see on this map. They go very far down north. They go up to Mesopotamia. Famous pharaohs that we have covered so far are Hatshepsut, the woman pharaoh, Tuthmosis III, who is very angry after Hatshepsut, his stepmother and half-aunt or something like that, doesn't let him rule, and King Tut because of his tomb that was left undiscovered. So let's cover from Tuthmosis III to Rameses II and just kind of give you a filler. Okay, so do you remember we studied Hatshepsut and then Tuthmosis III, who's angry, and he wipes out Hatshepsut's name. Afterwards, you don't have to remember these, but I'm just adding them so you kind of get a mental image in your mind of how many pharaohs have passed between what we last studied and what we're going to study. We have Amenhotep II, Tuthmosis IV, Amenhotep III, and then we have Amenhotep IV, or Akhenaten, who changes Egypt's religion from polytheism into monotheism and worships the sun god Aten. King Tut is the pharaoh after Akhenaten dies in a plague. King Tut begins to wipe out the work that Akhenaten did. However, he dies young. King Tut's wife's grandpa takes over. It's kind of a strange story that we don't have time to get into, but he takes over. Then after he dies, the army chief's general takes over. And his name is Horemheb. Now, Horemheb is interesting. He reigns for 28 years. He finished restoring the temple of Amun, and he destroys the rest of the temple of Aten. So he finishes off the work that King Tut started in bringing back Egypt into polytheism and just destroying what Akhenaten had done. He then restores the priesthood of Amun. Remember, Akhenaten had just said, hey, Aten doesn't need any priests, so you're irrelevant. So he gets rid of them. Horemheb brings them back, which would prove to be a terrible idea, and we'll see why later. Then he appoints Rameses I, a soldier, as his heir, because he didn't have any kids. So Rameses I begins the 19th dynasty. So all these pharaohs we've covered so far in the New Kingdom were part of the 18th dynasty. Susan Wise Bauer says that Rameses I was the first pharaoh ever with absolutely no blood connection, real or imagined, to any previous line. So thus far, all the pharaohs have been related, or at least some story was made up about how they were related to the pharaoh. Rameses I is the first one who's just like, oh, you can be pharaoh, and he did. So that's kind of a shift there. He died a year afterwards, and he did nothing important in his year. So Rameses I passes on the throne to Seti, then to Rameses II, who is probably one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history. So Rameses II. I'm going to give you a brief overview. Rameses II is known as Ramses the Great. He reigned for 67 years, from 1278 to 1212 BC, and he dies at the age of 96. Something very unusual and, in my opinion, weird about him is that he had 200 wives and concubines, so he had 96 sons and 60 daughters. Now, I'm going to give you a little side note here. One of the reasons that Ramses II is very famous or popular is because he was for a long time associated as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Now, we covered in our other video why that's not the case and how the Exodus definitely happened at a different time than Ramses II. But if you watch the movie like Prince of Egypt, pretty sure I haven't watched it for a long time, but I'm pretty sure he's the pharaoh who is depicted in that film. And that's one of the reasons why he is a popular pharaoh, but not the only reason, which we'll see. So again, we're going to cover two specific things about him, the Battle of Kadesh and his building projects. We're going to start with the Battle of Kadesh, 1274 BC. So the Battle of Kadesh, so cool, is called the greatest battle in very ancient times. It was between the Egyptians and the Hittites. And I'm going to show you on this map right here. So as you can see, here's Egypt right here. And here's the Hittite Empire right here. And here's Kadesh. I want you to remember this. You see how it's on the border between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. The Battle of Kadesh brought about the signing of the first international peace treaty in history. Like, how cool is that? So before we talk about the battle, I want to give you a little background information on the Hittites, because you're probably like, who are the Hittites, Mrs. Hernandez? So I'm going to tell you. So Mesopotamia, last time we left off, we talked about how the Sumerian civilization collapsed in 2004 with the Elamite invasion. Then we had the Ice-and-Lars period, which was messy. All these cities were fighting. And then eventually Shamshi-Adad takes over the city of Assur, and he creates his Assyrian empire up north. However, Hammurabi takes over Babylon, or becomes the king of Babylon from 1792 to 1750. And he conquers Rim-Sim down in Larsa, he conquers the surrounding cities and the regions, and he conquers Assyria, and he controls all of Mesopotamia at this time. So keep that in your head. The Hittites begin to build an empire in Asia Minor, as you can see on this map, and they're doing this at around the same time as Hammurabi, which is why I wanted to review that, okay? So this is happening at the same time. There are small villages being united by war leaders, and they began keeping written records around 1790, so again around the same time as Hammurabi, and this is when they are considered to have entered history because they have these written records. They're eventually conquered by one king who unites them, and then eventually they begin expanding into an empire. I'm being very general and simplistic. If you want to know more about them, Susan Wise Bauer has some great chapters on the Hittites in the history of the ancient world, so go check those out if you want to learn more about the Hittites. So the Hittites conquer Babylon, but they don't keep it. So by the time Hammurabi dies, Babylon is weak and they're losing their land, and it's becoming like Babylon is just shrinking. And in 1595, the Hittite king conquers Hammurabi's great-great-grandson. So this is a couple hundred years after Hammurabi. But they don't add Babylon to their empire. It's way too far away to govern, but the reason they did this is because Susan Wise Bauer says he had made his point. He was the most powerful conqueror in the world. Up to this point, we have Hammurabi, so strong and powerful, like the Babylonian Empire, and as they began to fade, the Hittites are like, hey, if I can conquer them, pretty much I'm on top of the world. So he does, he leaves, and it leaves a vacuum, a void that needs to be filled, and the people who fill it are a band of nomads known as the Kassites, and they come in and they take over Babylon. They're going to end up ruling for about 400 years, but we're going to talk about that later on when we discuss Babylon. So the Hittites gain power. So a lot of things happen between this point and the Battle of Kadesh. The Hittites are taken over. They take over other kingdoms. We don't have time to cover it. Again, if you're interested, go read these chapters. But they slowly become a powerful, powerful empire. So powerful that they can battle with Egypt. So let's go back to the battle. So around the same time that Rameses II comes to the throne, the Hittite king Muwatalli had taken Egypt's northernmost holding of Kadesh, like I showed you on that map. Susan Wise Bauer says Rameses II did not wait long before picking up the fight against the Hittite enemy. In 1275, only 3 years or so after taking the throne, he began to plan a campaign to get Kadesh back. The city had become more than a battlefront. It was a symbolic football, kicked back and forth between empires. Kadesh was too far north for easy control by the Egyptians, too far south for easy administration by the Hittites, whichever empire claimed it could boast superior strength. So here are two empires that really don't need this city. It's too far away from both of them to do anything with, but whoever has it can claim that they're on top. So pretty much like two kids fighting. Yeah. Anyway, so the Battle of Kadesh. Rameses II sends spies to Kadesh, and he finds out from the Hittite guard who's in Kadesh. Remember, the Hittites are holding Kadesh at this point. So he finds out from a Hittite guard that Mu'atali's army is far away. Yeah, you don't have to worry about them. They're way too far away to do anything because they're doing other things. They're busy. So Ramses II takes 20,000 soldiers and marches them in 4 different companies named after the 4 different gods of Egypt, and he marches them to Kadesh, and this is a 2-month journey. However, this was all a setup. So Ramses II is marching thinking, yeah, the Hittite soldiers are nowhere to be seen. This is going to be so easy. We're just going to take it over. But it was a setup because Mu'atali had 48,000 soldiers ready. 3,000 were in chariots waiting for the Egyptians to arrive. And their chariots are interesting because in each chariot, there were 3 people, a driver, an archer, and a shieldman. Like, they tried to be very undefeatable. So Susan Wise Bauer says, while Ramses had his back turned, pitching camp just west of Kadesh with his 1st division of soldiers, Mu'atali's army poured out from behind Kadesh like a sweeping thunderstorm. So here he's just like, okay, we're going to set up camp and then like sleep, and maybe next day we'll go and take the city over because their army is far away. And as he's setting up camp, the Hittite soldiers just come in and they completely outnumber the Egyptians. But the Egyptian soldiers were camped out in this really small area, and the Hittite soldiers the chariots kept bumping into each other, and they ended up crashing. So they're battling, and the Hittites didn't know that Ramses II had sent reinforcements from the sea, so the Hittites had to fight a 2-front battle. Many of them were, the Hittite soldiers, many of them were hired soldiers, so they're not very well trained like the Egyptians. And so the Egyptians are outnumbered, however, they kind of have an advantage in being better at battle. So the Hittites end up drawing back at dusk. The next day, fighting continues, and even though, again, the Hittites outnumber the Egyptians are now prepared and they're ready. And the fighting ends in a stalemate. Mu'atali and Ramses II agree to a truce. Kadesh was left with the Hittites. And this is the first recorded international peace treaty in history, which I have right here, pictured right here. However, Ramses II went home declaring victory. He carved accounts of the battle 9 times that we know of onto temple walls. And the accounts of the battle became something children learned and they recited and they used as, practicing their handwriting on at school. Just a side note, in the Hittite version of the story, the Egyptians were the first to ask for a truce. So interesting how that works, right? Susan Wise Bauer says, the Battle of Kadesh, even though it was more or less a draw, became an emblem of Egyptian superiority, which shows how far Egypt had come from its previous greatness. Egypt was still mighty, but it had become an empire that depended on reputation as much as actual strength to keep its position as a world leader. Had Egypt's army truly been as powerful as it appears in the reliefs of Rameses II, he would not have turned and marched home again, leaving Kadesh in the hands of the Hittites. Instead, Ramses devoted himself to the symbols of dominance. He built, within the safe territories of his own land, more temples, statues, and monuments than any pharaoh before him. So it happens that Ramses II gained a reputation as one of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history, when in fact he had lost part of the northern holdings gained by Tuthmosis III 200 years before. So basically, Ramses II is looked at as this amazing, powerful pharaoh, the greatest, but he really relied on reputation and all these symbols of dominance, as Susan Wise Bauer says, in order to propagate this kind of image. Which moves us on to building projects. Joshua J. Marks says, Ramses II erected so many monuments and left so many inscriptions that there is no ancient site in the country which does not bear some mention of his name. Like, that's pretty That's pretty crazy. So let's look at his buildings. So he had his own inscriptions added to existing monuments and buildings. Okay, so they were already there. He had nothing to do with them. He's like, add my name on there. Then he built so many statues of himself, more than any other pharaoh had done. Then this is so sad to me. This is so terrible. He destroyed statues and monuments of previous pharaohs in order to use the material to build his own. So again, Egypt is not necessarily as strong as before. So instead of saying like, go get all this material and build stuff, he's just like, oh, just take that down and use it to build what I tell you to build. So the most famous thing that Ramses II built is Abu Simbel, which is a temple complex. So it's built in Nubia. It takes him 20 years to build. Again, it's a temple complex cut into a rock cliff. There are 4 massive statues of Ramses II, and it's built first as a symbol of Egypt's power. He wants to show off how strong they are. He also builds it for himself and Queen Nefertiti, his favorite wife out of his 200. You can see a picture of her right here. And he also builds it to commemorate his victory at the Battle of Kadesh. So here are some pictures. And I want you to just keep thinking about these images as I tell you this little interesting tidbit that a friend of mine and fellow teacher told me, that this temple complex was in an area where many years later they decided to build a dam, and they were like, well, what are we going to do with this? It's going to completely destroy Abu Simbel. So they, brick by brick, took it apart and transported it to a different location, and you can hardly apparently tell the difference from where it was first built, because they did such a good job transporting it. And yeah, I think that's just crazy. Okay, so let's get into the end of the New Kingdom, the decline of Egypt. So after Ramses III, who we won't talk about, he's probably the last strong Egyptian pharaoh. Many weak pharaohs follow him. As the power of the pharaohs decline, the priests of Amun take more control. The people see the priests and not the pharaohs as intermediaries to the gods. So the priests are the ones who communicate directly to the gods, not the pharaoh. The priests are incredibly wealthy and they have a lot of land. Eventually, the priests take control of Thebes and they end up ruling Upper Egypt, while the pharaoh only has Lower Egypt. So Egypt is divided once again. I'm going to read this quote to you so you can kind of see why the Egyptians who viewed the pharaoh as a god for such a long time, even if it was just like more tradition than anything, why they would be okay with the priest taking power. The king no longer represented God on earth, but was subordinate to him. Okay, that's a big shift. Pharaoh is not a god. The pharaoh is under the will of the god. It says, just like all other human beings, he was subject to the will of God. Once it had been recognized that God's will was the governing factor in everything that happened, it became mandatory to know his will in advance. Oracles, which had originally been consulted only by the king, perhaps as early as the Old Kingdom, began to be used to consult the god on all sorts of affairs in the lives of ordinary human beings. That just means that before oracles, only the king could consult these oracles to try to figure out what the will of the gods were in order to tell the people what the will of the gods were. These oracles began to be consulted by just everyday people. Now, all of these developments further minimalize the role of the king as God's representative on earth. Remember, the pharaoh was thought to be a god. It says the king was no longer a god, but God himself had become king. Once Amun had been recognized as the true king, the political power of the earthly rulers could be reduced to a minimum and transferred to Amun's priesthood. That means that instead of the pharaoh being Horus, pharaoh being a god, they said, well, Amun, the god, is the king. The pharaoh is just under the god. And so who's going to be more powerful? The pharaoh, who's just a guy who's under this god, or the priest who can interpret and tell you what the god says? And that's why they are able to gain gain power, and this is a worldview shift within the Egyptians. This brings us to the third intermediate period. Egypt is now split, much like it had been during the first and second intermediate period. Territories Egypt had acquired, like Nubia, Syria, Palestine, revolted. Egypt was powerless to do anything. Remember, this happened before in the second intermediate period when the Hyksos take part of Egypt. Egypt is unable to keep control of Nubia. And this brings us to the end of Egypt as we've studied so far. Joshua J. Mark says, the country entered into another era of division and weakness known as the third intermediate period, but unlike the previous times of transformation between unified eras, Egypt would not emerge from this one stronger and more advanced than before. The first and second intermediate periods led to the middle and the new kingdoms, but the third intermediate periods concludes with the Persian invasion of Egypt following the Battle of Pelusium in 525 BCE. After the Persians arrived, Egypt never again became an autonomous state for any great length of time. That just means that Egypt was not able to rule itself. Other people always ruled Egypt. The 30th dynasty succeeded in reestablishing Egyptian rule, but the country was again taken by the Persians, who would rule until their defeat by Alexander the Great. The closest the country would come to Egyptian rule again would be under the dynasty of the Ptolemies, 323 to 30 BCE. The Greek rulers who revived Egyptian customs and traditions. Theirs would be the last dynasty of Egypt before the coming of Rome. So kind of sad that we've studied all of this, and after the third intermediate period, Egypt is controlled by all of these other countries, and we'll study about Rome in Egypt later on. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.